When working with fractions, algebraic fractions, where variables are in the denominator, we have to be aware of the restrictions. You can never divide by 0. Therefore, you always need to make sure that the value of the variable in the denominator will never cause the denominator to have a value of 0. The variable can have the value 0 as long as the denominator does not have the value 0. So let's find the restrictions for the given fractions. This first example is worked out for you, 8x minus 12 divided by 14x plus 7. All that we're concerned about is the denominator not being 0. So we're looking at that denominator, we factor it, then we set each factor to 0 according to the zero product property, and then we solve, and we find out that the only value x cannot have is negative 1/2. Let's look at another example. X squared minus 4 is divided by x squared minus 4x plus 4. And again, we do not want the denominator to be 0, so we're going to take that denominator, x squared minus 4x plus 4, and say that it cannot be 0. That's our restriction. X cannot have the value that would cause this entire expression to be 0. When you solve a problem that has more than one variable, we typically like to factor it. We break down the first term, we break down the last term, and then we check the sign. When the sign is a plus, that means that they're going to be the same. If you want to know what they are, you look further into the problem and you notice that they're both going to be subtraction signs. And this cannot be 0. So now that we have multiplication and 0 is our answer, we're using the zero product property, that if you're multiplying 0 is your answer, then one of the factors has to be 0. Now what we want is it for it to not have the value 0, but we still write it like we did before. In solving this equation, we would add 2 to both sides of the equation, even though it's a not equation, and we have x is not going to have the value 2. Now again, doing the same process here, we'll see again that x cannot have the value 2, and as long as it doesn't have it once, it doesn't have it 3 times, it doesn't really matter. So our only restriction for this fraction is that x can never take on the value 2. Okay, one more example. X squared minus 1x minus 2 is divided by 1 minus x squared. Now regardless if you can factor and reduce this problem, I'm asked to just find restrictions. So I just take this denominator, 1 minus x squared, and I say that it cannot equal 0. To solve this, I'm going to factor, because I'm getting really good at that. Break down the first term, 1 times 1. Break down the last term, x times x. The last sign is a minus. That means that it will be one that's a plus and one that's a minus. If I smile, I see I have nothing left in the middle. And this is not supposed to have the value 0. So we have our x plus 1. According to the commutative property, I can write it in that other order. That's one factor that can't be 0. And the 1 minus x also cannot be 0. To solve this first equation, or not equation, I will add a negative 1 to both sides of the not equation. So we have x should not have the value negative 1. And in this other not equation, I will add x to both sides of the equation. And that will have x cannot take on the value positive 1. So there are 2 restrictions for this fraction. X cannot have the value 1, and x cannot have the value negative 1. So those are our restrictions.